Thank you, everybody, for coming this evening. I'm Laura Silly with the Danvers Historical Society, and we're very pleased to have Dan with us again tonight. He's done a lot for the Society and the Rebecca Nurse Homestead. Thank you, Coley, for your technical expertise. And so we will welcome.
Well, thank you all for coming out this evening. I might take my mask down since I have plenty of room between you guys. I want to make sure you can hear me in the back rows there. I'm very happy to be here, very happy to talk about my new book, A Biography of Salem Witch Trials victim Rebecca Nurse. Sorry for a couple-minute delay with the projector. Just a typical technological minor setback. So what we have today is really a very world-famous Danvers story. And since I know that I'm talking to the Danvers Historical Society, I really want to think of it that way. In many ways, when one thinks of the Salem Witch Trials, you think of Salem. In a very natural, reflexive way. When you think about October, you think about where many tourists come to, all the news headlines about Salem has so many visitors this year, these museums are selling out, and all of that. And it's been that way for several decades at this point in time. Whereas we here in our backyard have many of the most important historical sites related to the witch trials. We have in Danvers far more buildings with direct connections to the witch hunt than Salem. It's just a little quieter. And it's not quite as advertised or promoted, but truly the historical resources are here. The main historical figure my book is about is, of course, Rebecca Nurse. Her home was on what's now Pine Street in Danvers. It's still set up as a museum today. It's the only home of a victim of the witch hunt that you can go visit. It's not at Salem. But yet, it's often not given the amount of attention as it should be. And with Rebecca Nurse in particular, this name might be familiar to many of you from The Crucible, perhaps. I think it's how many people are first introduced to the witch hunt probably in high school. It seems like most high schoolers read The Crucible. Rebecca Nurse being a key figure there, I think is something that really did expand knowledge of her and put her part in the Salem witch trials on a national or international stage. That being said, Crucible is not perfect, which is why we need a historical biography of Rebecca Nurse. Until this book, there had never been a full-length book, a full-length biography about any one of the individuals who were victims of the witch hunt. There are some books that would do little summaries of several different historical persons, but there was never one complete biography. And that's really what led me to this project, in that there seemed to be a real need for it. If one, for example, goes to visit historic sites across America, other places around the world, there's always a book that tells the story of that event and that individual. If you went to Mount Vernon, think about how many biographies of George Washington that they would have on the shelf. You would probably have dozens to pick from. Yet if one were to be visiting the Salem Village historic sites and went to the Rebecca Nurse homestead, there was never a biography about Rebecca Nurse to really get people into the story, to hear it in full depth. And that is why I undertook this project. For me, I did study history in school, and I studied contemporary European history. So it was not the first project that one would imagine I would have undertaken. But it was the one that I saw the most need for. With my background, I had, for many years, been a volunteer at Rebecca Nurse Homestead, which is how this story became exposed to me. It was my first job as a high schooler. And so I was tied in well before I ever went to study history in a academic sense. And when I do mention that there was no real biography of Rebecca Nurse, there was a small pamphlet that was put out that I definitely feel obliged to mention. Charles Tapley's looking at me on the wall there. In that he had written a short piece about Rebecca Nurse about a century ago. And that was the only available book. It's very short. It's about 60 pages. It's only about this tall. It's not even full-size pages. It's absolutely tiny, and it only examined her life during the witch trials, whereas it's a very limited view. And of course, if one only studies during the witch trials, one doesn't really understand all that's leading up to it, which therefore get to be your causes of all of these events. And also, one part that I focused on additionally with Rebecca Nurse is what happens after her death. Many biographies, it would end there. She is executed during 1692, during the witch hunt, and that's where many books leave off. But we have yet another really important Danvers story in there, whereas Danvers would be the first community anywhere in North America to memorialize somebody who was accused of witchcraft. That will be Rebecca Nurse. She's the first remembered. And so filling out that story is what I hope is a good contribution, and is definitely an aspect that isn't as discussed, isn't as talked about, and surely not in Mr. Tapley's book. 100 years ago, the legacy is not quite what it is today. You didn't have the Crucible bringing this awareness. You didn't have Salem Village Witch Trials Memorial on Hobart Street. That the story has expanded and needed to be up to date. Even though you think of an event 325 years ago, not necessarily as needing to be up to date. In this case, it definitely is, and we're still dealing with that legacy. And this town has made great strides to make sure it's not forgotten, to preserve sites. So as I kind of go through some of our discussion of the book, I wanted to frame it around some sites that you've gone by, might live near, might be in your neighborhoods, and we can kind of introduce some of the main players in Rebecca Nurse's life. And can kind of give you a little bit about what the book will entail and the full story, as much as we can talk about it in just our short time together here. To begin, we are living in Salem Village, even if we might call it Danvers. You can see on our map, Salem Village is roughly where Danvers used to be. Here we have the city of Salem, this is Peabody, and we have Danvers. We would be, I have a little zoomed in version. We would be over, I should have a mouse. Over, you can see my mouse, here is Danvers Square. This is Maple Street, this is Conan Street, this is Elm Street, and there is no High Street, so it's only a three-way intersection. Even back then, big crossroads, a lot of traffic, just not our kind of traffic. Our biggest chunk here, you can see in the zoomed-in version, is the outline of the Rebecca Nurse homestead. It goes down here, over here, here to the mall, and all the way up. Whereas today, it's only about 10% its size, about 30 acres instead of 300. But this really is, of course, the focus of the biography of Rebecca Nurse. She moves in 1678. Not many, a few years before 1692, we get about 14 years of her time in the village. Prior to that, living in downtown Salem. And although this is where most books about the witch hunt would start, I wanted, if you would oblige me for a minute, to show you a much broader map, something I put together from my research. This is a map of sites in the life of Rebecca Nurse. And our starting point, well before Salem Village on the east coast of England, we often forget that the witch trials really does tie in with the first European settlers of North America. Rebecca Nurse was born in England, in Great Yarmouth, a tiny little seaside town with a beach right opposite the Netherlands. She comes over at the age of, we believe about 14. We can narrow it down to a 1-year period in which she would have arrived, but we don't actually know the name of the ship, and we don't know the exact month that she arrived. Part of that is the Puritans, like Rebecca Nurse, who were leaving England due to religious differences, didn't always leave legally, and so maybe there's a reason that we don't actually have the paperwork one would expect. So here I have in this dark red in our very modern Total Wine and Home Depot little labels down there. The dark red is what Rebecca Nurse's farm used to be, and today that's the Nurse house here on Pine Street. So you can see it is a sizable chunk of downtown.
Wow.
That being said, it's pretty typical. We have most people in Salem Village that were farmers back then. Salem Village, actually a pretty bad place to be a farmer. And so you needed 300 acres in order to support your family. In other parts of North America, if you had 300 acres, you would be practically swimming in money from how productive that could be, but not so much in New England. With some of Rebecca Nurse's neighbors that will be playing into this story, one of our other Danvers focal points along the way is the First Church of Danvers, which is the same congregation that was here during the time of the witch hunt. The building is not the exact same location, it's a little further down the road, but this is the same institution. We're fortunate in a way that that institution continued through to present times in that it aided us in, they preserved their own records. This is really important. Had the church merged, had the church gone bankrupt or gone away, we probably wouldn't have the documentation that we need to study the witch hunt. So this is a private organization that has really, in these past centuries, contributed to history. Other sources that were really important in this project belong to the Danvers Historical Society. The Danvers Historical Society here, or downstairs, keeps many of its three-dimensional objects. There's items, there's muskets, there's a whole collection of different swords. We have there's paintings, murals in the Society's collections, but its paperwork was given on loan, permanent loan, to the Danvers Archival Center in the basement of a library. And so these documents that one would access through the library were actually owned and kept by this society here we are today. They were very important. The society happened to have an original copy of the deed to the Nurse family's farm. Who would have thought that this would have survived? With all of the farms and all of the homes in Danvers, only a couple colonial deeds. Fortunately, it was one that I needed, which is always nice and convenient when you find what you're actually looking for. With the church here, this is where Rebecca Nurse, many in Salem Village would have attended what they called Sunday services. This is what it would have actually looked like, not our modern 1970s building. This is a copy of the building on the property of the Rebecca Nurse homestead, built from the original plans, meant to be as exact as we can. And it's within here that the village gathered, the village exchanged news every Sunday, people interacted, and this is where many of our historical figures for the witch hunt would have first met one another, first been introduced to people across the village. Those who went on to become accusers, those who went on to become accused, knew each other from this setting. The whole community, or essentially the whole community, went there every week. This is where you intermix. One of the key families involved in the witch hunt, that especially if you read The Crucible, gets a bad rap from Arthur Miller, most definitely, is the family of Thomas Putnam, whose home unfortunately does not still exist. This is the only one I'll show you that's where it used to be. All the others will be things that are still there. With this family, they had been one of the oldest families in Salem Village, now Danvers. They are cousins of the family of General Israel Putnam, who the hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill, who said, "Don't fire until we see the whites of their eyes." He's only one generation away from this. Many of these revolutionary figures are contemporaries. He's born not until after the witch hunt, but his father is involved in this. And so this would be his uncle, the Revolutionary War General's uncle. Many of the main accusers of the Nurse family, their home's over towards the state hospital. It's near Putnam Lane. It's actually Danielle Drive, or around there, so kind of just north of Putnam Lane. These became Rebecca Nurse's key accusers, especially Ann Putnam Sr., the mother of the family, and Ann Putnam Jr. And fascinatingly, out of other accusers and other accused, throughout the witch hunt as a whole, we often see things that could be contributed to maybe a grudge that is taken way out of proportion in some instances, particularly the non-Salem Village ones, like people in Andover who were accused. It seems like a lot of grudges, some people in Topsfield. With the Putnam family, when they accused Rebecca Nurse, the cause is interesting to investigate because they essentially, Ann Putnam Jr. claims to not know who she was. So we have this close-knit community that attends meeting every Sunday, these religious services, and yet, being so spread out across town, you might not know one another. Moving past them, we have the Holden House in Danvers, which we think of, again, Revolutionary War connection. Samuel Holden in the Continental Congress. That's what the sign says in front of it. That's what seems to be the important part. In this family, in this family has lived in this home. One of Rebecca Nurse's closest neighbors, part of the family will defend Rebecca Nurse, and part of the family will attend her trial and accuse her of witchcraft. We have families that split right down the middle. In this case, you have a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law who go in very different directions here about their neighbor. We return to the Putnam family, to this home. Israel Putnam's connection. His father defends Rebecca Nurse, whereas his uncle and his family are one of her main accusers. We see splits not just in the village, but in families itself, which is what leads to this true chaos and disruption. And as we continue here, we have one of the main figures, likewise frequently vilified when one sees films about the witch hunt, when one sees television programs. The Reverend Parris, the minister in Salem Village, often takes the fall for the witch hunt happening. There are claims that he is somehow masterminding this. There are claims that he's using it to settle his grudges, that people who somehow offended him, people who maybe didn't support him, and that therefore he is the one to lodge all of the blame against. From what I have found, I definitely do not think that that is the case. I think that he has a lot of faults, and one of our biggest faults is he does testify against Rebecca Nurse, and he testifies to things. He swears, as the Puritans would do in court before God, to tell the truth, to things that he couldn't possibly know. He doesn't start our witch hunt, though. The reason that he's blamed for this, and as we get to Rebecca Nurse being accused, is the parsonage site here as it looked in the 19th century, and here as it looks today behind Center Street. The parsonage, the minister's house, is where our story of the hunt itself begins. It's in his home that several young women first began to be unwell, claimed to have fits, rolling on the floor, screaming, crawling under furniture. There's one example of his niece who was living with him at the time, in addition to his younger daughter Abigail. Those were the first two to claim to be afflicted. His niece runs into a fireplace and tries to run up the chimney while there's a roaring fire going, much to her parents' horror and the horror of the neighbors that are there and witness this. This behavior is fantastic and truly frightening. You can read the descriptions of this in our primary documents. Visitors come to Salem Village and write down what they see. And it's simply not believable that people could behave this way. They describe these so-called afflicted as like contorting their bodies into ways that they didn't think you could do, almost speaking in tongues, making noises. It's something that they had no explanation for and really must have chilled them to the bone from these descriptions. It is truly, the witch hunt is a story of people. It's not a horror story in a supernatural sense in any sort of way. But it doesn't mean it wouldn't have been very frightening. And that's something that I think really, really shines through. With these early afflicted accusers, they don't immediately name names. And this is why I kind of question how most historians have written about Reverend Parris, particularly in past decades, trying to place blame on him. Something is clearly very wrong. Something these individuals are either unwell, something has happened to them, but I would argue against any sort of conspiracy, which leads us to the question of how such a thing could come about. We, as you'll see, I will examine whether there's mental illness playing a role, particularly in some individual cases that we know more about. We can kind of see some influences. And then we're going to see some levels of fraud and lies and false evidence. And it's kind of a spectrum for each person who's accused, or doing the accusing, probably where they fall along these lines. With Nurse herself, she's not among the first to be accused. She's a well-respected woman in Salem Village. She's an important member of the church. She's 71 years old. Prior to living in Salem Village, she had lived in what we would consider today the city of Salem, so she's been in this neck of the woods a long time. And her neighbors, judging by how they react when she is accused, defending her, testifying to her good character, held her in really high esteem. This is another reason why I wanted to focus on Rebecca Nurse. Out of the witch hunt as a whole, we have about 200 people who will be accused. We have 19 hangs, 1's pressed to death, and 5 die in jail. In a pretty limited amount of time. From the beginning of February through to October. There's a lot of victims of the witch hunt. There are a lot that could be focused on. I pick out Rebecca Nurse, not just because of my connection to Rebecca Nurse Homestead, which of course factors in and plays a role. But there's plenty of other cases of people from Danvers that could have piqued one's interest. They are all, of course, innocent, and so all of these cases are significant and important. But Rebecca Nurse really seemed as though she is the least likely person to be accused, and then the least likely person to be found guilty. And that's why I think her case is very special. Historians have gone through and done all of this data and statistics of certain traits that might have made one more susceptible to witchcraft accusations. Being a woman is one of them, as the majority of people accused of witchcraft in colonial New England are women. It's a large majority. It's not even close to an even split there. It's a large majority. Other than that, she doesn't fit many of these roles that I'll go through. Particularly one of them is people who are not well-liked or more likely to be accused of witchcraft. That, as they, everyone's human flaw. I think we can see how that could play into a situation such as this. But with her, she's recognized in the church as a member of the church as what they call a visible saint, which meant someone they believed was going to heaven. If the community thinks that's not just highly of you, that is as high as a Puritan could think of you, how do you go from there to the lowest of the low, a witch, allegedly, somebody who has, as they would say, forsaken God and instead teamed up with the devil to try to overthrow the church and destroy the Commonwealth of Massachusetts? That is the charge. You are undermining the Puritan church and the colony, the Commonwealth, as we would have it today. Those arrested before her did fit more of these stereotypical, but typical traits that would lead one to be accused of witchcraft. We have the early Salem village accused. We have Tituba. She's a slave in the minister's household where this first began. There would be suspicion based on proximity alone to this. Never mind that she is a Native American, not originally Puritan. She is a woman. She was in charge of caring for these young children who became to be unwell, so in a sense she had responsibility there. She is accused of witchcraft first. Next up we have Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, women from opposite ends of Salem Village, both within what would be Danvers. Sarah Good is essentially a beggar, not very well liked, known to mutter against people. Muttering, fine. But once witchcraft accusations start going around, it was the question of what was she muttering all of those years? Were these, curses or something like that? So we sort of see views change as to what would have been considered normal everyday action. After that, we get Martha Corey, who's from Peabody, had a reputation of being a little disagreeable. And then we have Rebecca Nurse, seemingly unblemished. No reason that we can pick out that would lead her to be targeted. Others have talked about socioeconomic issues such as envy. They were pretty much constantly in debt. Not really one to be envious of. They were behind on their mortgage. Doesn't really seem to fit. We have other historians who've written about different divisions in Salem Village. This is one that I think a lot of people are also familiar with, other than the Crucible, would be this idea that there's two factions. There's like two groups in Salem Village, and the witch hunt is merely one political group. There's another one, and they're also economic, because one is supposed to be doing better, one's supposed to be doing worse. Well, by looking at Rebecca Nurse's case, we have some pretty clear evidence that this doesn't make sense either. This doesn't really line up. This has been a theory for decades. Only recently other historians have tried to pick apart, like, well, that one part of it doesn't really make sense, and that one part. But with Rebecca Nurse's one case, one of the most important families allegedly in that idea, you really kind of like pull the rug out from under that one. The idea is that the family that accuses Rebecca Nurse, the Thomas Putnam's family, were opponents of them in every sort of way. If we go through, we see that we agree on pretty much everything. Not likely to have conflicts between these two families. Politically in agreement, economically similar, the same religious, social beliefs. And so we can kind of set aside what has been long held as our reasons here. I have this building up next. When Rebecca Nurse is accused and then arrested, she's taken by the sheriff to this structure, which is right across from the First Church of Danvers, the corner of Hobart and Center Street. It was the tavern in Salem Village. In addition to the meeting house, the tavern would have been the best place to hear this gossip, to hear what's going on in Salem Village. And that's also where many were first exposed to what people were being accused of, these wild, fantastic stories that are told. And we only have, the official version of what happened. You can only imagine what the people at the bar, what kind of a yarn they would spin about this. We're going to have, throughout 1692, people claiming that some of these accused witches could walk on flying saucers, would fly across water, would hex people's animals, wild things to the point that we're going to have one gentleman who's afraid that one of his animals has been hexed, and so he takes his pipe and he puts it in the rear end of the animal, and the animal makes some air and almost burns down his own bummer by sticking his lit pipe in the rear end of his horse. How can you make that even more fantastic and unbelievable than that? But I'm sure if one was in Salem Village, you would have found an even more embellished story of all of these things. Moving next up here, she would have been brought after her accusal to the meeting house. Originally in the tavern is where a court would typically meet. Seems weird. Why would the court meet in the local bar? Not what one would expect. It's really the only public building, the only building that wasn't just somebody's house, so that's why it's done. But so many people turn out to see these hearings. Your first hearing in front of the judge is like an arraignment today. Are they going to keep you in jail for trial or release you? At these hearings, so many people turn out. Salem Village will become almost theatrical. So many villagers will come to this meeting house, but people from surrounding towns, we have people as far away as Gloucester that will come down. Can you imagine what horrible dirt path you'd have to travel to get here from Gloucester back then with just your horse and your wagon? You'd be really dedicated that you're going to see something that you would thought was worthwhile to see, even though it's a horrible event, to come all the way down there. People come up from Boston. You had to take ferries. Then you had to go about 12 miles on these horrible roads to get to Salem Village. Well, what was happening here was so compelling to them that they would make this journey. Well, others who come from southern New Hampshire, where the border would be today, but they'd be in southern New Hampshire. It's a little different then. So people are coming far and wide. With this, I wanted to show you on, if I can return to my light for a second, our story does extend far beyond. What I mapped out here, which is available online, I can give you guys the link, are hopefully every site related to 1692 that involves Rebecca Nurse. We have the jail where she'll be sent after her initial hearing. It's the telephone building on Federal Street in Salem, right near the parking lot. On Church Street there, there's nothing there today. Again, we have far more structures connected to the witch hunt in Salem. Salem has a lot of former sites of, unfortunately, just being a bigger city, there's been more redevelopment in that sense. This line, looking at maps from the 17th century, this is where the prison convoy of those from Salem would have gone. Yeah, the roads are still used today, not quite, Route 1. Coming to the ferry, coming to downtown Boston, right near the old State House is where they were transferred to. I mentioned the 200 people accused. It's a lot of people to try to fit in jail. Our view of the Puritans might be that they were very law-abiding and very proper in some regards. It's not entirely true. They got sent to jail for ridiculous things, being drunk in public, causing disturbances, things like that, just like any society at any point in time. But they've never had 200 people accused of a crime at once before. There's no facilities for that, there's no system, there's no judicial process that can deal with that, which is why people had to be sent here to Boston, and then she will have to make a return journey when they decide, no, never mind, not going to have trials in Boston, we're going to have them in downtown Salem. She's put on trial in June in that year. I mentioned it begun at the beginning of February. She's accused late March 25. Then she'll be put on trial beginning at the end of June. She's endured horrible jails. I mentioned that 5 had died in jail. Another thing that's often overlooked, we focus on those who were outright executed, of course, in a way, the biggest victims there, certainly. But there are plenty who just die along the way in the process. Jails are horrible, disease, terrible conditions, and they're frequently overlooked. That's actually another plus that I'm happy to be speaking here at the Danvers Historical Society, in that when the memorial was put up in downtown Salem in 1992 for the 300th anniversary, they had a big production, design competitions, international competitions to build this memorial. And they left out all the people who died in jail. They're not listed as victims of the witch hunt, who obviously they were not in jail by choice. They are very much victims of this systemic, this process that was the judicial system as it was. Definitely not going to call it the justice system, because that is far from what we received at that point in time. With our events in Danvers, I am going to skip ahead, which is a little unorthodox, I know, but as I mentioned, the memorial. Our focus here in terms of how this organization, this society has contributed to our remembrance is really key, that we've included those people. When there was fundraising for this memorial here in Danvers in 1992, the Historical Society played a very large role. The memorial was entirely built by donations. It was money that organizations donated, clubs such as the Rotary, the Kiwanis, the organizations like the Rebecca Nurse Homestead, this society, all sorts of civic organizations. It really was the town coming together, and they made sure to include every single person. The famous cases, like Rebecca Nurse, the less famous cases. For example, one was an elderly woman from Reading who passes away in jail. Nobody knows where she wound up buried. It's not really a site of where her home used to be. Would have been otherwise pretty much forgotten, but she's included on the memorial in Danvers. And so I really think that's something for us to highlight. With Rebecca Nurse, I'll leave it up for a second. With Rebecca Nurse's story herself, in the book I'll go into details of her trial, the evidence for her, the evidence against her. She has more of a defense than any other person who's put on trial in 1692. Again, it's fascinating because it's like the least likely case, the least likely person. As I already mentioned, I suppose, giving the result ahead of time, despite that, she will be executed in 1692 in that July. She is one of the 19 executed. And the final part of the book that I think is key is, and what I hope is a good contribution, and I had actually spoken here at the Historical Society a few years ago about how some of these victims were memorialized after the fact. Is that the Salem Village community stands by Rebecca Nurse. There's some who will accuse her, and the majority support her. Her family will stand by her. They know that she's innocent. They know that she's not doing any of these things. She's not using witchcraft to harm these young women, and then later will be adults that accuse her. She's not at all. And that they will rally to her defense. And the last key part is her memorialization, which is what I skipped by to get to our memorial there. We have here a gathering with many who would go on to found the Danvers Historical Society. In 1885, this is the backfield of the Rebecca Nurse Homestead. There is the family cemetery there. And that monument behind them is the first monument to anybody in North America accused of witchcraft. It is just like that memorial in 1992, built by the community, by her family, generations later, of course, by 1885, and it's built through donations. We have an event that was so important, just as I mentioned, during the witch hunt, people who came from all over to see it as it happened. The Salem Village is clearly the center of it. Well, in 1885, we have a formal program of the event with the Old Nurse Homestead, and it's reported far and wide. Here we have the Boston Globe with a really disproportionate picture of what that looks like. That's what it is. That's how the Boston Globe people thought it looked like. So I don't know what artist they hired for this, but I don't know, makes it a little more important, I guess. And you got a little picture of the nurse house here. It's going to be front page news in Boston. It'll be in the New York Times. It'll be in newspapers in Canada, Britain, France, Australia. This event, this memorial in that quiet little field in Danvers is truly worldwide news. There's going to be papers all across America who will report on it. Some in Virginia, some out in Minnesota, even the German community in Minnesota, the newspapers in German from Minnesota that will report this event in Salem Village. It's such a big event at the time. It's such a big event here at the First Remembrance, which I think makes it really fascinating how, like I said to kind of start us off, everybody goes to the city of Salem. It's fascinating how that has shifted and not continued there. With Nurse's memorialization, I would say this is also really important in that other historians had talked about memorialization in a far briefer way, and it often given credit to the city of Salem as first confronting its past. We can think of Salem at the turn of the century as having Daniel Lowe made little silver spoons that had a witch on the handle. The witch becomes the symbol of Salem, soon it ends up on the police cars, on the football team, and that gets embraced. And that it was assumed for a long time that use of that image culturally meant they had come to terms with it first, that they had used it first, somehow totally overlooking this first memorial to the only person in North America accused of witchcraft that had a memorial at that point in time. Just because it's in a sleepy field, it's out of the way, who would look there, who would go into it. Meanwhile, it's in our backyards. Some of us maybe literally, actually, as they look around, but some of us at least nearby to our homes. With Nurse, this was here, a picture of the 325th anniversary in 2017. We have a memorial to her that's put up in 1885. 1892, the 200th anniversary, they'll put up a memorial to everybody who defended her in 1692. The names of people who signed the petition, who testified in her defense in court, that court, that the family, the community knew that they had to honor Rebecca Nurse, most obviously innocent, realized to be innocent pretty much months after the witch hunt ends, very, very quickly. She is brave in defending herself at her initial hearing before the judges. We have Judge Corwin, John Hathorne, another, if you think about the Crucible, a key player there. She defends herself, speaks in her defense in her trial. But it's those really putting their necks on the line are the neighbors who defend her. They could have been accused next. Someone in their family could have been accused next. You don't want to associate yourself with someone accused of witchcraft because anybody could be accused. If a 71-year-old, well-respected church member like Rebecca Nurse is accused, it really could be anybody, and it could have been you who was standing up at that trial. And so that, I think, is really significant and really fitting that there's also a tablet with the names of those who support her there. As you look at those names, you will see many Danvers names. Holden, some of the Holdens, as I mentioned. Some of the Putnams. There's the Rays that have many historic homes that are the Ray family that still exists from colonial times in Danvers. And really you can kind of see, in fact, not with the lights off, but in the back we have our plaques here at Tapley Hall that have the names of some of the most influential figures in the history of Danvers that are memorialized back there. If you look at their last names, you're going to see a connection to many of these families that support Rebecca Nurse, that they are those original colonial families, and they had ancestors who were on the correct side, if you will, during the witch hunt, sticking up for these accused victims. I wanted to pretty much leave you with that, and I have one final thing. Speaking of Salem tourism, I came across this little map from 1911 that was published that shows some of the historic sites in Danvers that people could visit. So, although we might be a little behind in number of people, this is Holden Street, Center Street, Hobart, sticking down there. Many of those buildings I just showed you were published for tourists even back then. And our final slide here. For more information about the book, you can go to my website, and I have a blog prior to this that I occasionally post on about Danvers history topics. That's where you can find that map. If you wanted to look through the map, see where some of these events took place, as you saw, it includes events well outside of the Danvers area, but many of them are within what would be today the town of Danvers. There's little homes marked of those who supported her, those who accused her, where she went after she's accused, as you saw that little road before she goes into Boston. And I I like to visualize things. I think it helps me to understand seeing pictures and maps. And so I definitely wanted to include that in this and make that available to you. And I think that's a really useful tool. I would be happy to answer any questions at all that you have. I'm so happy you came out to hear about the book, and those of you who read, I truly hope you enjoy it. It's a good local story, a tragedy, but one that is really important to our community, I believe. So thank you very much. Yes?
What is the image you used on the book?
Excellent question. So this is a photograph from the 1890s. There's a whole collection of photographs, actually it's a collection of negatives, that the Peabody Essex Museum has. There was this guy, Frank Cousins, who must have been one of the earliest people to have a camera around here. And he went in the 1880s and 1890s, and he took a picture of every historic building on the North Shore of Putnam. Kind of everything. So if you want old pictures of downtown Salem, the collection is available online now. It's through the PEM, and it's amazing. And he also took pictures of some objects. He actually has a great picture of, this is one inside of the Page House, as it used to look. And there's others that have Historical Society here artifacts, like some of the swords I mentioned. There's a picture of a bunch of swords from Historical Society. This one, glass jar, and it has pins inside of it. You can kind of see them like standing up there. This is one of the few artifacts we have from the trials itself. This is in the law library of the Essex Superior Court on Federal Street in Salem. These were in like the box with the original trial documents. And it was always said that these are part of what was entered as evidence in the trials. At Rebecca Nurse's trial, there's an example of someone saying that witchcraft was done to them by a shape, a specter, and it stabbed them with a pin. Allegedly, these are the pins. Some of them, we think, others, I'm not going to take credit for that one, others have looked at them and thought that a couple of them may have been the paper clips from the original documents that held them together. Others, they think are regular pins. And so that could be evidence from the trials themselves. Regardless of which of those two categories, they are from the trial. They are from that time and were kept with the documents all along. So they have them, it used to be in a, not sure right at this moment, on the shelf there that you could go visit. It's also good that he took pictures of it in the 1890s, because now you can't bring your cell phone into the courthouse. So I actually would not have been able to take my own picture of them. So it's good that he had a photo of it. Yes?
Yeah, I didn't know that there was a memorial to people who had died in prison, and I was just wondering if that memorial included the daughter that Sarah Good gave birth to while she was in prison.
Yes, it does. Sarah Good, one of the earliest accused, they were one of the first three, had an infant who she is imprisoned in February, and we know that the infant is in jail with her and passes away before June. We don't know the exact timeline there, but we can kind of narrow down the window to late April or May, somewhere between there, because she's transferred between jails, and so that's how we can kind of narrow it down. But yeah, is mentioned. That's a great question, because again, of all the victims of the witch hunt that could be forgotten, well, that is
Yeah,
surely
well,
a case that could.
And also Sarah Good, so I work at the Wenham Museum, which is, Wenham is associated with Sarah Good because Sarah was born and raised in Wenham. So I know a lot about Sarah Good, and her daughter, her older daughter, who survived, was also accused of witchcraft, but survived jail, but was never the same afterwards. And I suspect that it's probably not a memorial to her, but maybe there ought to be, because, she basically disappears from history after she's released, after her mother and sister. After her sister dies, her mother is executed, she kind of goes crazy. And her stepfather, who raised her after that, was given some compensation money to take care of this child after the trials had ended, basically saying, she's never been the same, she's never going to be the same. And then he's given this compensation from the court, and then they both kind of disappear from history. And so I've always been fascinated by her story as well. So she's sort of become nameless at this point.
Yeah, it was Sarah Good's oldest daughter. That is important to mention, that even those who do survive and live through this are in many ways never able to be the same again. Whether in that case it seems to be true mental issues from the descriptions to continue, or others who I think about returning to that community alone afterwards. And so with Sarah Good's oldest daughter, she's actually sent to jail the same day as Rebecca Nurse. They enter that same March day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so after the victim was hanged, was the family allowed to claim the body and have a burial? What happened to them?
We believe so. There was no law against it at that point in time. In some, not states, but some colonies, they would, if they executed you, they'd like leave you there for a while as a warning. Massachusetts did not do that. So you would have been most likely like hastily buried whenever you were hanged. But we think pretty much all the families would have retrieved the bodies of their family members and reburied them. We have only one that was ever found. That was George Jacobs, whose farm was down in Danvers, and that is a really convoluted story. But they found him digging a cellar. It was a bulldozer that found George Jacobs in the 1950s. They examined the bones, and they always knew that he was somewhere right around there. And through that description that it fit with him, it fit with the way that he walked. He had canes, he had arthritis, the bones were the right age, the right time period. He's reburied in the cemetery at the Nurse House. And the reason for that is they've long assumed that Rebecca Nurse was also reburied there. That's why they put the memorial to her there. Back in those days, unless you were somebody very fancy, like yes, Judge John Hathorne does have a headstone in Salem, being very wealthy. The average Salem village farmer did not. You just have a rock in the ground. And your family knew where everybody was. You couldn't afford a giant carved stone. And so there are rocks in that cemetery. There would be that first generation. One could very well be Nurse. The other part of thinking it's in that cemetery is that it was said that she was the first buried on the property, and they started the cemetery around her. There was no other Nurse family member that had passed away or been buried there. There's others, like in Peabody, the Peabody Historical Society, a couple of years ago, their curator and others had gone through to see where John Proctor might have been buried. And they thought that it was likely, as the other families, that he had been buried on his farm. He's never been found, so that's not you don't really have a confirmation of that, you don't know. But they had narrowed it down to one of his fields. It's actually right behind Peabody High School. The woods back there is where they thought the most likely spot was. And others, we don't really know. But the George Jacob example is like proof of concept. Yes, the family could rebury him because they found him, and that shows that you could have done that. Yes?
My family, the oral history that's come down through the generations, has said that Rebecca was cast into a ditch, and that her 5 sons came and claimed her body and brought it back to the homestead. That's what my family has just said for generations.
Yeah, and it probably would have been her sons. Her husband was similarly, for that day and age, considered elderly. But it's her husband and her sons who drive her defense at trial. It's clearly they, and her sons-in-law also, who are organizing this, and so that seems very plausible. We don't have any records saying that happened, but it would seem possible, or it could fit. Yes, sir.
Each time you talk about her accusers, you use the term young women. Today, I think of young women as 35, 40. I used to think it was 20. How old are these young women?
Well, it changes as time goes on. The first and the prime accuser of Rebecca Nurse is going to be and Putnam Jr. And the second leading accuser, who really plays the largest role, is her mother. When I say younger women, the first to claim to be afflicted are women, girls in their teens, and then some in their early 20s. That's the very beginning, and then it will spread to adults. So by young women, in that case, I would mean early 20s, late teens. And Putnam is very early teens. She is actually one of the youngest of the young. But her mother would be considered middle-aged at that point in time and has several other children. And then it goes on to, there's going to be at Rebecca Nurse's trial, my example of the pin, that somebody uses a pin as fake evidence, will be a woman in her 40s who will accuse Rebecca Nurse and claim directly to be attacked by specters and images. That would be in Rebecca Nurse's case, the oldest to claim that they were actually hurt. There's other witnesses, though, who will be older, who will testify at her trial. They just don't claim that they themselves were hurt. They will claim, I saw other people being hurt.
Is there if it started with 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, is there a history of calling them younger women, the term women, to not say they were girls?
I don't know if intentionally so. One thing that's often been a misconception is that it's been girls, that it was described, actually I'm thinking of the Crucible as a circle of girls, using a 1950s word, a gathering of girls, I guess we would say, who are incredibly young. And they're often described as around 10, 11, 12. That is misleading, and there's so many that are older, and so that's why I think young women is used, just because it kind of also includes the late teens, early 20s block, and it doesn't make it seem like it was just people around the age of 10, 11, 12. Yes?
So after all these people were executed for witchcraft, what happened to the town after that? Were they still afflicted, or did they all just magically act normally again?
Eventually, it will return to quite normal, but fairly normal, with the witch hunt continuing through October. We have Bridget Bishop is the first executed at the beginning of June. She's not the first accused, but she's the first put on trial and executed. Then you have a second round of half a dozen, including Rebecca Nurse, executed mid-July. Half a dozen mid-August, half a dozen mid-September, and that'll be it. After that, the court thought that they were going to meet again and made plans to meet again when the government of Massachusetts suspends it and stops. So that's about October. At that point in time, the court is suspended because people were realizing it had been wrong. It had not been true that these people, many of them, especially cases like Rebecca Nurse, should have been given the benefit of the doubt. And so that doubt continues. As to when the last person has a fit and claims to be attacked, we don't know. We know that there are accusations through the beginning and mid-November. So presumably continuing to then. We don't know when the last accuser made the last accusation. We just know the last one was taken seriously enough to charge somebody with a crime. That's our records. We unfortunately don't have the record of the gossip or the rumor. It's very true diaries. Many people couldn't write back then. So we are restricted, unfortunately, with something like that and what we do know. That's a good question, though, in that one can only imagine how a town can try to put itself back together after this. Yes?
One of the other things that has been told to me is that young Ian Putnam was essentially shunned after this all kind of died down, and then she never had any. Is that true?
Shunned, we might not have a direct document that says that, but it is immediately clear once this ends that it had not been true. And that these people who did testify in court had not done so accurately. They will turn against Reverend Paris immediately. the families of those who he testifies against. We have plenty of documents about that. So we know the feeling against him for testifying in court. We can assume that there's also very hard feelings against Ann Putnam. Yes, she does not marry. Her two parents died naturally only a few years later. She has many younger siblings that she has to raise, and she dies young herself. So the family doesn't, from her end, doesn't continue. From her siblings, the family does continue. But no, she never marries. Yes, sir?
Does any accuser ever recant?
Sort of. And our sort of does come down to Ann Putnam, who you had asked about. Ann Putnam is known as the only accuser who apologizes. She ends up talking in the church about 15 years after the witch hunt. And she, 15 years later, wants to join the church. Well, you had to get voted in to join the church. And here you can get to how people would have viewed her. This is a big problem, in that so many members of the church who would vote are related to people she had accused, and many of whom had been executed. So, something is worked out. In the minister, a different minister, by now, not Reverend Paris, speaks with her. They write up an apology. It's clearly his words. You don't even know if she could write. And a lot of the words are advanced Puritan words that clearly a minister would have written and not her. And this is read to the church as an apology. On the one hand, it works. She's voted in, surprisingly. On the other hand, I don't like the word apology because she never says she did anything wrong. She says basically what it comes down to is the devil made me do it, which is not taking any personal responsibility. And so I would say if you apologize, you have to take responsibility in order for that to count. She would be the closest, though. Others, we lose track of. With Reverend Paris's daughter, we know they move out near Lexington. Others just kind of disappear and are hard to track down. With so few records back then, and many of them being women, once they're married, their name changes and they go to some other town. You can't follow the line. We don't know. Other people who will recant, one of the judges will recant. The others will never, and think that what they did was just. They will continue to claim that they were correct, and they go on to get promoted and all these good things, and they never have any sort of, reckoning. So only one will recant, and it's Judge Sewell who actually becomes a really early anti-slavery activist after this. He was from Boston, and many of the judges are from Boston as opposed to being local. Any others? Yes?
How many months or years of research does this book represent for you?
Several. I would say about 3, a little over 3. And in addition to it being an interest to me and that it's such a great local story, I will say it's also convenient to be here. If I lived in Los Angeles or something and had to fly out here to go to the Danvers Library, that would have been not as logistically feasible, or to go to the Peabody Essex and see like the documents of Rebecca Nurse's trial. It definitely helped that I was down the road. It would have taken longer otherwise. Yes?
The witch trials, some people use as a watershed. That before the witch trials, people could say, "Oh, she came into the room and I felt the pain," or something happened to me. And after the witch trials, people had to have data. Did you, were you stabbed? Were you, show me something. And I'm wondering about why, if the trial didn't happen in Boston, because people felt, we don't want to touch that one.
Yeah, so it was assumed that they'd be put on trial in Boston, that's why many of them were sent to the jail in Boston. Prior to this, every single capital case had been tried in Boston, because it had to be tried by the highest court in Massachusetts, which is in Boston, as now. They don't do that. Because of some complicated political reasons, they have to establish a new court that year. And they decide that since it's based, all these accusations are based in the Salem area, all of these people would have to travel from the Salem area to Boston. Really just more convenient to do it in Salem, in the building where the normal county court used to meet. Now, in terms of the evidence, we see at the end changes to how trials will be conducted in many sorts of ways. What we do see, though, is this event, this era, is really the beginning of the end of any time that somebody is formally tried for witchcraft. It's not the last time somebody will be accused of a witch and killed, but it's the last time that courts do it. There are other instances of some angry mob killing somebody. That is, of course, not a judicial process. So this is the last time that we see the government in a court of law doing this. And what we'll see afterwards is that November, only a month after it ends, Massachusetts will pass new laws about how trials are conducted. What are the rights the defendants have? What evidence can be used? They're going to change the definition of witchcraft. Really makes it, that's the key that you could really never again prove that somebody did that. And so that will be really a sense of finality here in Massachusetts with that issue. So you're right that the evidence has changed, and people's views certainly have shifted after that. There will be days of, they'll have a day of repentance about 65 years afterwards. Massachusetts declares a day of public humiliation over what has transpired. They don't really do that anymore. But that just shows how seriously this was taken as a tragedy.
I was wondering if maybe people in Boston said, you know, already felt that way, said that's not the kind of thing, we don't want to be involved in that.
That they were more skeptical than
Well, the people were already saying, there's no evidence, there's no, you know, what are you talking about? A bunch of people said, a specter or whatever happened and I felt pain or something or my dog died and this isn't a real trial.
There's a little bit of that, we'll see. We will see some of the leading skeptics in Boston, just as that's the most educated town. Many of the leading figures in Massachusetts were in Boston. And there's one in particular who writes a letter. Back then, hard to get the word out here in the newspaper, so people would write letters that they know would be passed from person to person, a circular letter. And one of them, Brattle, writes a letter. It's a discourse between one person labeled Boston and one person labeled Salem. Well, the one labeled Boston is skeptical. The one labeled Salem is meant to be the court, not necessarily the people in Salem. But you can kind of see there a difference. But he really means the judges. As the Salem aspect. Yes?
Do you think this happened because of that Puritan religious cure people had? I mean, could this have happened in another colony where they weren't Puritans but were more Church of England?
Yes, it could have, in that it does happen in Old England, where people are put in trial by the Church of England, whereas here it's the government that is running the courts, so it's not any sort of church. But in England, you would have been put on trial in a Church of England and Anglican a church court. So it does happen there. We see witch trials. The other interesting thing about Salem is that most places had stopped us by then, and Salem's kind of on the later end. But in the early 1600s, 1500s, France, Germany, you have Catholics, Lutherans, other Calvinists that weren't exactly Puritans were also involved. The Puritans get a rap for it, though. Really because of the New England angle. You have Massachusetts, you're also going to have instances in Connecticut. And so definitely the American view is Puritanism, and even in England some of those involve Puritans too. But it could have been any religion. I mean, the belief in witchcraft is so widespread then, from important professors at Oxford, kings, queens, just down to the average person. So it's believed in all of those countries, all of those different religious groups.
Dan,
Yes.
sort of a great work. Congratulations on the book. I brought mine. Kind of a minor point, but I've seen the spelling N-O-U-R-S-E and N-U-R-S-E. Did that present, was that something you had to think about, or did you find in your research that it went back and forth? Some people spelled it one way, others spelled it another?
It's a good question, and we would think about, so you're gonna write, we're looking to a historical figure. Well, everybody knows how their name is spelled. You take that for granted, everybody knows how you spell Washington. There's no like debate about it, it's really straightforward. Or Adams, or another figure like that. With names back then, they really were not standardized. Part of it is so many people were either not able to write, or they could sort of write, and spelling was just as you hear it. Nurse is interesting. In all the records, it's either N-U-R-S-E or N-U-R-S. You don't pronounce the E, so they just forgot about the silent E. Probably the way they said it is Norse, with the longer U. And so later on, that's why it's spelled with the O-U, because people weren't saying it right. It's probably the pronunciation. It's not that they changed their name to avoid connection to those accused of witchcraft, because I think people could figure that out. You didn't really change your name that much. And none of the others' families would have changed their names. Rebecca Nurse's sister marries and becomes Esty. That's another one that's spelled several different ways, but it's based on how that person thought you spelled it. So it really is just not a standardized way. When they build the monument to her, even as late as the 1880s, this is a question. Some of the things refer to that group collecting money as the Norse Monument Association, but the rock says Nurse with a U, because that's based on what it was in 1692. And so that is a weird inconsistency. We have a lot of inconsistencies. I should have put on here just a picture of how they used to spell normal words back then. And it is in English, but if you read through it, sometimes it doesn't seem it. So thank you for that question.
Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you.